The Counterfeit Cashier by George A. Best. Part 1. It would seem that there are a few of the pomps and vanities of mankind more innocent of harm than a well-trimmed mustache or beard, or a pair of now happily obsolete whiskers of the mutton-chop variety. Yet it was on account of their ability to work mischief to the determinant of the form, and for no other reason, that these simple adornments were denied in the working staff of the prosperous banking house of Dorrington Brothers. To speak more plainly, a cleverly planned and brilliantly executed robbery resulting in the loss of the firm of £500 sterling was directly responsible for the inauguration of the rule which is still regarded by the banking fraternity in the light of an official absurdity and somewhat flippantly referred to by Doddington's employees as the anti-whisker regulation. To accomplish their purpose, the thieves chose as an unwitting accessory one of Thomas Darwin, a cashier who was long since retired from the firm and is therefore in a position of independence which might well be suited to include side whiskers among the other luxuries of a retired life in the suburbs. But Darwin still plies his razor with the remorselessness born of habit, and something else besides. The something else, in this case, represents the gist of my story. At the time of the robbery, Darwin was a tall and somewhat spare man of 45. He was bald at the crown of the head and wore mutton-chop whiskers and a heavy mustache. Stooping slightly and walking with a short, springy step, strongly suggesting of a high-class marionette, Darwin possessed an individuality which is very marked. He was regarded as a reserved and even taciturn man who seldom spoke on any but business subjects during the office hours, and some of his colleagues were wont to remark that Darwin always carried his pen as a bit between his teeth in order to curb any desire for conversation, or an exchange of confidences in the immediate neighbors. These little peculiarities of manner and of carriage earned for their owner the nickname of Automaton Darwin. On the 28th day of June, 1881, Thomas Darwin left his home in Ringgold Road, Clapton, to catch the 8:55 a.m. train to Liverpool Street. The train left Clapton station neither sooner nor later than usual, but for the first time for many years a certain corner sat on the off-side of the 10th compartment of the engine was appropriated by a stranger. Automaton Darwin was absent. The circumstances which for once had proved strong enough to disorganize even the automatic regularity of Thomas Darwin are interesting, inasmuch as they afford the revelation of the infinite pains taken by the authors to discover the most vulnerable point of an usually strong character. Darwin was well known in the north of London as a bird fancier of extraordinary enthusiasm, and an imaginary canary was his only decoy used to the effect to capture an unsuspecting cashier, as the first and most important item of the criminal program of unusual interest. Darwin had turned down one of the quieter thoroughfares leading to Ringgold Road to High Street when he was accosted by a who had hurried to the gate of the large and apparently empty house which stood back a dozen yards or so from the roadway. The man wore a plasterer's cap and a long white apron. His face was plentifully smeared with the whitewash which had apparently been used indoors, and which still dropped from the brush in his hand. "Mr. Darwin," he gasped excitedly, "there's a beautiful bird, something like a canary, in one of the top rooms of this house. It flew through the window while I was washing the ceiling, and when I saw you coming down the road, I said to myself, 'Here comes the very gentleman of all others that can tell me what the bird and what it's worth.'" Darwin gazed curiously at the speaker for a moment, then consulted his watch. "I can only spare a moment of minutes," he said, And it's a long climb to the 4th floor. Can't you keep the bird until I return from the city this evening? Or better still, bring it by to my house in Ringle Road. I shall be home by 6 o'clock. The honest British workman shook his head sadly. I don't think the poor little thing will live as long as that unless it's looked after at once, sir, he replied. It's beating itself against the walls and ceiling so violently that there won't be much of it left to identify if I don't open the windows again and let it go. However, sir, I'm sorry to have troubled you. I thought you might be interested, having read some of the articles in Bird Fancier's Guide, and knowing you but well by sight. But don't go and lose the train on my account. Perhaps it's only an ordinary canary, after all. For a moment, Darwin hesitated. The 8:48 down whistled to the Clapton station, scarcely 100 yards away. He had still quite 6 minutes to spare. The plasterer was already slowly walking up the weed-grown path towards the open door of the house. Darwin flung open the rusty gate and reached the hall door in a dozen quick, jerky steps. This way, sir, cried the workman, mounting a heavily oaken staircase once more rapidly, without looking around. Be careful of the ladder on the second landing. It's a bit dark up there, and for the lobby window hasn't been cleaned for a year or two, and the paper hangers who were doing the first-floor rooms yesterday have left a lot of things about. At this moment, a heavy clang resounded through the house. The hall door had been hastily closed, and the crash was followed by an ominous shriek of a rusty bolt. It's only the wind, sir, explained the pastor, noticing that Darwin peered suspiciously over the banisters into the suddenly darkened hall below. A wonderfully draughty house it is. And a wonderfully draughty house it certainly was, seeing as the heavy door had closed with a reverberating crash, while the leaves of the chestnut trees outside were undisturbed by a single breath of wind. The canary's in this room, announced Darwin's guide as the last flight of stairs, liberally strewn with obstacles that had been slowly and carefully ascended. I reckon it'd been a breakneck job for anybody to rush a last flight, he added impressively, throwing open the door of a small room as he spoke, and respectfully making way for Darwin to enter first. A rough deal table stood before the center of the room, and a narrow iron mantel-shelf held an empty beer bottle, the neck of which was fitted a lighted candle. The apartment was as innocent of daylight as a banker's strong room. While Darwin was peering somewhat impatiently around the room to discover the whereabouts of the imprisoned bird, and the window by which it had entered, the door was slowly closed behind him, and turning sharply around, he was just in time to see the workman turn the key in the back. "What are you doing with that door, man?" he demanded angrily. "I'm just locking it in case of accidents," replied the workman coolly. "And to prevent any unauthorized person tampering with the lock, I've withdrawn the key and taken charge of it myself. We don't want the precious bird to escape after taking all the trouble, do we, Mr. Darwin?" With rapid movement, Darwin seized the dusty bottle, and regardless of the dripping grease from the candle, raised it threateningly above his head. "Open that door, you scoundrel, or I'll beat you where you stand," he cried furiously. "I'm not the kind of man to stand by any foolery of the sort, and I'll give you exactly 10 seconds to—" The bank cashier stopped abruptly. He was gazing into the barrel of a heavy revolver. And very firmly held within a couple of feet from his head. "Be as good as to replace our candlestick on the shelf, Mr. Darwin," said the plasterer quietly. "You very kindly give me 10 seconds to perform a certain movement in order to retain my brains, and I'll grant you the exact same time to which to save your own. Replace the bottle on the shelf." Darwin shrugged his shoulders and obeyed. "I suppose it's useless to argue with you under the circumstances," he growled sullenly. "Quite useless, Thomas," was the emphatic reply. "I'm glad to find you realize the utter helplessness of mere argument. Under the circumstances, it will make matters work more easily for both of us. And now I'll show you to the canary, for we've no time to spare." A trapdoor in the ceiling of the room opened mysteriously at this moment, and a pair of daintily trousered legs emerged through the aperture, followed by a frock coat, a pair of well-trimmed whiskers, and a bald head. These component parts of Lombardian respectability wavered for a moment in mid-air, and the sum total dropped lightly onto the deal table underneath. Darwin stared wildly at the newcomer for a moment, and every particle of color fled from his face. The man was an exact counterpart of himself. "You devil!" gasped Darwin hoarsely, as the whole of the cunning devised plot was revealed at a glance at the faultlessly attired figure on the table. "You're going to impersonate me at Dorrington and rob the bank!" "I guess I'm going to try," was the quiet answer. "I think that instead of using ungentlemanly language, you ought to be really grateful for me for undertaking your work for a whole day, Mr. Darwin. I've had 10 years' experience as a bank cashier, and I'm fully aware of the exacting nature of your work." "That get-up is absolutely perfect, Dick!" exclaimed the plasterer, admiring. "Upon my soul, you're more like Automaton Darwin than the original is at the present moment. Our excellent model appears to be hardly himself this morning." Darwin's double produced a small mirror from his pocket and surveyed his features critically. "I must touch up the left eyebrow, Jack," he said, addressing his colleague. "Scarcely grey enough at the nose end, but the right-hand whisker wants darkening a bit, and my scarf is tied too neatly. Get my makeup box out of the cupboard, and be sharp about it. Darwin must not arrive at the office too late. It isn't like him." "I haven't seen a single minute behind time for the last 15 years, ejaculated the cashier triumphantly. "You'll be arrested the moment you enter the bank." "I don't think I shall," replied the double, with a bland smile, touching up rapidly as he spoke. "I sent a very discreetly worded telegram in your name explaining my unpunctuality. One of your colleagues will be therefore officiating at your desk when I arrive at the bank, so I shan't have any trouble about keys and locked drawers. I think that when you're seen me walk so and bent over an imaginary desk with a pen between my teeth in this fashion, and grunt a good morning like that, in the voice of the old weary parrot, you'll acknowledge that you've been a good master, and I an apt pupil." Darwin gasped. The imitations of carriage and manner and of speech were alike perfect. "What are you going to do with the money?" he groaned. "Pay it over the counter in the usual way, of course," replied the clever rogue cheerfully. "A number of my acquaintances, our mutual friend Jack among them, will call at the bank during the morning and present checks of various amounts, all of which will be duly honored and paid in gold or notes without any reference in the signature book. And while I am attending to these, to the ordinary customers at the bank, you will be allowed to remain in an interesting apartment and amuse yourself as you think best with the somewhat limited means at your disposal." "I shall amuse myself by excusing the thieves from this den," exclaimed Darwin defiantly. "And as for your plot, it's simply absurd, the most impractical thing I've ever heard." "That remains to be proved, Mr. Darwin," said the plasterer with a laugh. "And while you are engaged in making practical test of the scheme you are quite at liberty to escape from what you have ungenerously described as our thieves' den, if you can. We might have had recourse to chloroform or other less humane measures to keep you quiet for a while, but we have prepared to trust entirely to bolts and bars, coupled with a little gentle persuasion from the mouth of a loaded pistol. And now, as my city friend is anxious to catch up the next train, I must ask you to stand with your face towards the wall, so that we may make our exit with as much dignity and as little noise as possible. As soon as you hear the key turned from outside, you may attack either the door or the table, or anything else which you fancy. If you turn around or make any movement before that time, I shall be obliged to break my only commandment, and which I have taken any pains to keep." Darwin laughed harshly. "I have no fear of the safety of the bank, otherwise I might be tempted to defy you," he remarked somewhat weakly. "Let me see your back," demanded the man with the pistol. Darwin glared sullenly at the extended weapon for a moment, then turned to face the wall. The apartment in which the unhappy cashier was imprisoned was well chosen by the perpetrators of the Dorrington outrage. The window had been bricked up, and the heavy door was secured by a mortised lock and bolted on the outside. The trapdoor in the low ceiling had been carefully locked and the key removed after the dramatic entrance of Darwin's double. It did not take the prisoner many attempts to realize that any attempts to escape from this cunningly chosen cage without outside assistance would be worse than futile. It was certainly possible that someone might be taking the air in one of the neighboring gardens far below, and this was a forlorn hope which had situated presently in Darwin's mind. Although the difficulty of communicating with the outside world from an apparently light-proof and soundproof den of the fourth floor of an empty house appeared insurmountable at best. The outlook was by no means an encouraging one, but Darwin was not kind of man to rest with folded arms after his first review of the seemingly desperate situation. On the contrary, he took a keen delight in weighing together the few possibilities and probabilities which the case presented, although it was obvious that the former would outbalance the latter on a 10-to-1 scale. Darwin's first act was to feel carefully for the Vesta case, which he carried in his waistcoat pocket, and when he was satisfied that the means of obtaining artificial light were available, he extinguished his candle. For a moment it seemed that the darkness of night had descended suddenly upon the room, but gradually the prison door was outlined by a single ray of sunlight, a ray so small and so dim that it felt feebly on the lower panels, leaving the rest of the woodwork in deep shadow. Darwin walked to the door and eagerly followed the course of the beam to its ingress. A tiny spot of white light, close to the ceiling, marked the spot at which the cheering ray entered. The cashier climbed onto his table and examined the wall thoroughly. The hole in the wall through which the light entered was so small that it might have easily been covered by a threepenny piece. Darwin struck the spot sharply with his clenched fist, and was delighted to find that his hand went clean through the wallpaper and out into the daylight beyond. At one time the room had apparently been ventilated by a simple expedient of removing a couple of bricks, and there was not even a regulation grating on the outside wall. On the inside, the primitive ventilator had recently been papered over, and this was probably the only work executed on the premises. Unfortunately, the ventilator had been built so near the ceiling that the imprisoned cashier could neither break through the aperture nor bring his lips to the same level. Standing on the tips of his toes with his right hand extended to the utmost, Darwin found that he could wave a handkerchief on the outside. But this movement, owing to the lack of space, was so slightly that it was scarcely likely to be noticed from below, much less interpreted as a signal of distress. For several minutes the excited prisoner stood on the tabletop, calling wildly for help, with his head thrown back and every joint of his body racked under the strain of the painfully extended arm, until the very agony of his position forced him to desert for a while, his only loophole of escape. The clock of the neighboring church struck 10, and Darwin, returning to the floor of his prison, glanced desperately around the room in search of any idea which might be inspired by a few inanimate objects in which the room contained. The inspiration came in the form of a roll of wallpaper which lay on the floor, and Darwin, realizing that the plan of the campaign was better than none at all, acted upon without a moment's hesitation. Unrolling the paper on the table, he tore it in half a dozen large squares and rapidly wrote on with his fountain pen a message to the blank side of each square, worded as follows: £50 reward. The man who's impersonating me, Thomas Darwin at Dorrington Bank, Lombard Street, City, is an impostor. Have him arrested without delay. I am imprisoned in a large empty house on the west side of Dean Street, Upper Clapton. Anyone delivering this message to the bank before 12 o'clock noon on this 20th day of June, 1881, will receive the above-mentioned reward. When the last of these remarkable messages had been completed, Darwin climbed the table once more, and another moment the first of the recently written messages had been posted through the ventilator, with an accompaniment of piercing yells which caused the stand and dignified cashier to blush for the very shame that he uttered them. A dog barked fiercely from the yard to the left, and a freshening breeze came the releasing message of the same direction. One by one the bills vanished from sight, and when the last fluttered away into the street, Darwin still stood by the tiny loophole, listening hopefully for an answer to his repeated exclamations and interrogations, which appeared to fall on no one more intelligent ears than those of the highly exasperated dog in the garden beneath, whose irritating yap rose superior to any sound in the neighborhood. An hour passed slowly by, and the clock at St. John's Church struck 11. Scarcely had the sound of the last stroke died away before an unmistakable murmur of voices rose faintly, but with sufficient distinctness to enable Darwin to locate his speakers, and to catch the opening words of a neighborly conversation which was apparently taking place in the garden to the right. It was simply a polite inquiry as to the well-being of certain cucumbers, which Darwin interrupted by a stentorian, "Below there!" The sensitive hound heard the challenge and answered it so noiselessly that it distracted the cashier danced on the table in a perfect frenzy of rage and excitement. "Lie down, you brute!" exclaimed the invisible speaker. "The dog's a perfect nuisance. Speaking of cucumbers reminds me." An empty beer bottle crashed through the cucumber frame at the moment. It fell from a great height and burst with the violence of a lyddite shell at the very feet of an amateur gardener and sympathetic friend. With a dismal whine, the dog slunk into his kennel, and lay trembling in the darkness corner. His master stepped back to the gate, angrily with the upper stony windows of the house next door. But the only sign of movement visible in that direction was a gently waving handkerchief, which flapped weirdly against the wall just below the eaves of the empty house. "Hello there! What the deuce are you playing at?" cried the enraged householder. "I'll see that you are punished outright to the cost of £50. "And I'll give you £50 to break into this house and let me out," came the strangely muffled voice of the owner of the handkerchief. Part 3. When the counterfeit Darwin arrived at Dorrington's Bank, he found, as he had been assumed, that one of the extra counterhands had been installed in the place of the absent cashier. A number of bags of gold and silver from the strong-room were being transferred by bank porter from the bullion trolley to the capacious closets beneath the counter, and the extra cashier was engaged in arranging certain bundles of Bank of England notes in their respective pigeonholes. One of the bullion bags had already been opened, and the contents transferred into the cash drawer of Darwin's desk. With the utmost coolness and nonchalance, the clever impostor replied to the greeting of the unsuspecting colleague, checked the number of bullion bags and the amount of loose cash, and ran through the bundles of banknotes with a firm yet rapid touch which only acquired by long practice. Then he dismissed the substitute with a laconic "all right," and cashed several checks for small amounts, canceling the signatures, filling the forms with a number of quick, jerky movements which were an excellent imitation of Darwin's characteristic business methods. His counterfeit of the absent cashier handwriting in the entering book was scarcely so successful, although well calculated to deceive a casual observer. Darwin usually broad-nibbed J-pen, and his entries took the form of a thick, undulating line which was quite ineligible at first sight. The impostor's calligraphy, for reasons of his own, was even more illegible. When the cashier at the desk E had negotiated a dozen small checks and received a packet of bills from a bank runner, a draft for the large amount was handed in by a well-to-do farmer. Some £500 in gold were weighed up and shoveled across the counter. The country person, exceptionally mild appearance, followed slowly to the rail of the farmer, and this dignitary received in return for the modest check of £50, which he presented 5 Bank of England notes for £100 each. This was the first of a long series of similar errors made by the fictitious cashier during the course of that exceptionally busy morning. Certain highly respectable and benevolent-looking city gentlemen received, without any protest or even comment, gold and banknotes representing more than 5 times the face value of the checks handed in. These greatly favored individuals left Dorringtons with a calmness of demeanor which is said to emanate from a quiet conscience, and wended their way one to the Bank of England, where the magic wand of the old lady of Threadneedle Street converted into bright new sovereigns the crisp banknotes which had been recently handed to them from across the counter of the Lombard Street Bank. The mild-looking curate and the well-to-do farmer, and 3 benevolent and highly respectable city gentlemen, were yet unscrupulous enough to impose upon the absent-mindedness of an overworked cashier of inferior social position to themselves, inaugurated a discreet and well-regulated procession to transact business with the kind old lady who never breaks her promise to pay bearer. So far, the whole of the daring and carefully prepared program had carried through without a hitch, and only one of the numerous clients of Dorrington's Bank had reason to complain of any irregularity or want of attention on the part of the cashier at desk E. Darwin invariably left his desk to luncheon at 12 o'clock and returned a praiseworthy punctuality precisely on the stroke of 1. On this occasion, however, the desk was closed and the drawers locked at 11:55, and Darwin's immediate neighbors were somewhat surprised to see their colleague don his in spite of the fact that a wealthy client had handed a draft for negotiation and was waiting. As a matter of fact, the counterfeit cashier had just received a telegram bearing a very important message that read, "Bird escaped, 11:30. Make tracks." So the recipient of the short but startling communication decided to make tracks without unnecessary delay. Even as he walked down the bank with quick, springy steps, a hansom dashed up to the entrance, and the man tumbled out of the vehicle in remarkable celerity, a tall, dark man with muttonchop whiskers and a very heavy mustache. It was the automaton Darwin himself. Darwin met his prototype with the doorstep, and throwing his arms around the other's waist, he loudly and somewhat incoherently called for assistance. Several porters and other employees of the bank sprang forward and tore the struggling men apart. The head porter gazed from one to the other in speechless astonishment. "Which is Mr. Darwin?" asked someone from the back of the crowd. This remark gave his impostor his clue, and he acted upon it immediately. "Arrest that man at once!" he cried, pointing at Darwin. "He is impersonating me for felonious purposes. He intends to rob the bank. Call in a policeman without delay." The astonished crowd at once turned to Darwin, who struggled fiercely and most unwisely with a dozen hands laid roughly on him, and was speechless with rage. "You fools!" he hissed at length. "What are you doing, idiots? Seize the other man. He's been robbing the bank since 10 o'clock this morning. Call the manager." The manager was already elbowing his way through the crowd. "What is the meaning of this, Darwin?" he asked sternly. "The other man?" gasped the cashier incoherently. "Arrest the other man!" "What other man? What do you refer to?" asked the manager irritably. "The rogue who has been impersonating me!" cried Darwin. "He has robbed the bank, and the fools have let him escape. He and his confederates imprisoned me in an empty house in Chapton." The manager shrugged his shoulders and turned inquiringly to the crowd. "There certainly was another man here half a minute ago, sir. He looked exactly like Mr. Darwin," explained the head porter. "But he must have slipped out after ordering us to arrest him. When we struggled so, of course we thought we had the thief, and the other one was a real Mr. Darwin. I hope you understand, sir, but it's rather a difficult matter to explain. It was all so sudden and unexpected that nobody thought of doing to detain both of them, and he was so much like him in his own reflection it was like in a looking-glass. I hope my meaning is clear to you, sir." "Not very," said the manager shortly. "Step into my room, Mr. Doe, and I shall probably hear a more lucid account of this highly complicated affair from your own lips, and in the meantime we'll send a wire to Scotland Yard." But long before the lengthy and almost incredible story was concluded, a tall, clean-shaven man had cashed £1,000 worth of notes at the Bank of England, and afterwards walked home in a leisurely way to burn a pair of mutton chop whiskers and a wig with a very bald crown.